Okay, good morning, everyone, or good afternoon. My name is Ainsley Thomas. I'm the Chief Diversity Officer at the college. And before we begin with today's presentation, let me acknowledge or read our land acknowledgement to the audience. Hudson Valley Community College is located on the sacred homelands of the Mohicanic or Mohican people, who are the stewards of this land. Today, the community resides in Wisconsin and is known as the Stockbridge Munsee Mohican Nation. We pay honor and respect to their ancestors, past, present, and future, as we commit to building a more inclusive and equitable space for all. Welcome, everyone, to our fourth annual MLK Speaker Series. Today, HBC welcomes Rosalyn Elder to campus to present the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Lecture for Black History Month. This annual event is co-sponsored by the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, the Marvin Library, and the Student Activities Office. Entrepreneur Rosalyn D. Elder is a registered architect with a passion for the arts, architecture, and cities, and history. She is the founder of African American Heritage in Massachusetts, a resource for educators and others interested in Black history. She holds a BA in art history from the University of Memphis, a Master of Architecture from the University of Washington, and a Master of Architecture in Urban Design from Harvard University. Between 1992 and 1998, Ms. Elder founded and ran Treasured Legacy, an African-American cultural boutique located at Copley Place in Boston's South End. She also co-founded and operated Jamaica Way Books, a multicultural bookstore in Jamaica Plain, Massachusetts. Her research focused on Black history in Massachusetts, uncovering both well-known and lesser-known stories. Her extensive research covers 742 sites across 141 towns in the state, contributing to her project exploring the legacy, people, and places of significance. Copies of her book will be available for purchase today, right in front of you. Elder's topic is reclaiming Malcolm X. This is a concept that refers to revisiting, reinterpreting, and understanding Malcolm X's legacy in a contemporary context. His journey from a life of crime and incarceration to becoming one of the most influential leaders of the civil rights movement presents a powerful narrative of transformation, resilience, and empowerment. The process of reclaiming his legacy is an attempt to bring forth his teachings in ways that resonate with modern struggles, particularly those surrounding race, justice, and identity. Folks, let's give a warm Hudson Valley welcome to Rosalyn Elder.
Thank you. Thank you, Ainsley, for a wonderful presentation. A wonderful introduction. I really appreciate that. First of all, I do want to express thanks to Paul Calarco. I don't know if he's here today, but he's the one that introduced me to there he is, Hudson Valley Community College, and I also want to thank Ainsley Thomas and Keisha Sawyers, who Ainsley invited me, and Keisha coordinated this whole thing, so thank you both. And before I get into my presentation, I do want to invite everyone to an event we're having in Boston called the Malcolm X Readathon Boston, where on May 17th and 18th, 2025, we are hosting a marathon reading of the autobiography of Malcolm X. And we plan to do that we plan to have that live streamed as well. So if you can't join us in person, Paul is going to be there. He's going to be one of the reasons. We invite you to join us online. Thank you. So May 19, 2025 will mark the 100th anniversary of Malcolm X's birth. But who was Malcolm X and why should we care? Malcolm X was a brave individual who journeyed from a life of crime and incarceration to become one of the most influential people in the second half of the 20th century. How? By challenging those complacent about racial violence, by courageously speaking out for those not empowered to do so, and by refusing to accept the status quo of the inequities of American society. Today, we want to revisit, reinterpret, and reclaim his legacy for a new generation, because Malcolm X's powerful narrative of transformation, resilience, and empowerment still resonates with our current struggles, particularly those around race, justice, and identity. And we can still learn much from his teachings. Malcolm X's words are timeless because they speak to the reality of racism in this country, a problem which is at the very foundation of our country's creation and the effects of which continue to this day. Malcolm X was born Malcolm Little on May 19, 1925, in Omaha, Nebraska, to Earl and Louise Little that you see here. Earl Little was a proponent of Black nationalism of Marcus Garvey. Garvey preached Black pride and self-sufficiency with his Universal Negro Improvement Association, or the UNIA as it was known. The UNIA and the NAACP, also known as the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, were two leading organizations for African Americans during this time, but they had extremely opposite philosophies. The NAACP demanded the total integration of the races. They focused on a talented tenth of the population who they felt could lead the rest of their race to equality. The NAACP was led by W.E.B. Du Bois. And they drew their membership from the intellectual and professional members of the population. The UNIA advocated for total economic separations from white America, even going so far as to organize the Black Star Line, a passenger ship that would carry Blacks back to Africa. The UNIA drew their membership from the working class population because they most understood the importance of who controls the jobs. Garvey's philosophy of separation and economic independence for the UNIA was a hard pill for whites to swallow. They wanted segregation, but not separation, because the former allowed them to maintain control of Black dollars. In fact, Black business owners were the primary lynching targets after the Civil War. One of the most devastating race massacres this country has ever known, the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921, was primarily a campaign to destroy Greenwood, a thriving Black business community in Tulsa that was also known as Black Wall Street. That two-day massacre was carried out by a coordinated mob of over 10,000 whites determined to destroy Greenwood, a thriving Black community of homes, hotels, restaurants, theaters, and all the other related businesses necessary for a thriving community. After the dust settled, over 300 residents of the community were killed, 35 city blocks had been burned to the ground, over 1,200 homes, churches, schools, businesses, a hospital, and a library were destroyed, and over 10,000 residents were left homeless. Over 100 years later, no one has been held accountable for this horrific crime, but their descendants are still grieving. Well, the whites in Lansing, Michigan weren't about to sit back while Earl Little campaigned to encourage the Blacks there to become economically self-sufficient. Members of the Black Legion, a Michigan version of the Ku Klux Klan, tried verbal intimidation, but that didn't work. So they became more aggressive, making it necessary for the family to relocate several times. Once, while Earl Little was away, Black Legion members shot up their house while Louise Little was inside, who was pregnant with Malcolm at the time, was inside with her 3 other children. Another time when Earl was present, they set fire to the house with the family still inside. Earl Little shot at the fleeing arsonists with his pistol, but they managed to escape. Meanwhile, the house burned to the ground while the white police and fire department just stood and watched. The family just barely managed to escape with the clothes on their backs, and the only person questioned in relation to that arson was Earl Little for possessing an unregistered firearm. The message from the Black Legion was clear. We will hurt you and your family, and if you try to defend yourself, you will be punished. That unspoken threat was common knowledge to every Black man in America. It was probably one of the topics discussed back then when Black parents had the talk with their children. The talk was a colloquial expression for instructions Black parents gave their children about what to do when they found themselves in uncomfortable situations with whites, because their survival may very well depend on it. In 1928, the Little family settled in East Lansing, Michigan, where Louise Little had 3 more children. Earl and Louise taught their 7 children to be self-reliant. They grew their own produce, raised their own chickens, and killed any other game that they needed from the woods. One of Malcolm's proudest early childhood memories was taking care of his own garden plot. Quote, "One day I went and asked my mother for my own garden, and she did let me have my own little plot. I loved it and took care of it well. I loved especially to grow peas. I was proud when we had them on our table. I would pull out the grass in my garden by hand when the first little blaze came up. I would patrol the rows on my hands and knees for any worms and bugs, and I would kill and bury them. And sometimes when I had everything straight and clean for my things to grow, I would lie down on my back between 2 rows, and I would gaze up at the blue sky with the clouds moving and think all kinds of things," unquote. Earl Little continued to travel around the local communities, preaching the gospel and spreading the word of Marcus Garvey, and Malcolm often accompanied his father on those occasions. Hearing his father, whom he admired, repeat Garvey's words and the UNIA's philosophy of total separation and economic self-sufficiency so many times probably had a subconscious effect on Malcolm. In 1931, Earl Little died either from a streetcar accident, as reported by the local police, or he was murdered by the Black Legion, as rumored by the local community. Whatever the cause of his death, that tragedy put the family on a downward spiral from which they never were able to recover. That tragedy was made worse due to 2 simultaneous events our country was experiencing during this period: the Great Migration and the Great Depression. The Great Migration began during World War I, and it was the mass movement of entire families of African Americans from the harsh living conditions and the blatant racism of the Jim Crow South. And Earl Little was part of that migration when he left Georgia for the North. Those migrating families wanted to begin afresh in the North, Midwest, and the West because the South was entrenched in its campaign to denigrate African Americans, to subject them to humiliations reflective of being under the foot of the white racial hierarchy. Blacks could not vote. They were beaten on whimsy. They were cheated out of wages and property. And lynching was used to instill fear in the rest of the Black population, as Southern whites unleashed a reign of terror to reestablish their dominance in the South. Lynching numbers never got as high as they were in the late 1800s during Reconstruction, when they approached 200 in many years. But the numbers were still high enough to keep many Blacks in a constant state of dread. And there was little African Americans could do about those injustices. If they complained to the law, they were locked up and beaten severely. So the only power they had was to protest with their feet and leave the region. Worried that their cheap labor source was leaving, Southern whites monitored the transportation routes, but the flow could not be stopped. Over the course of the next 6 decades, over 6 million African Americans, 40% of this country's population, made that journey, the same journey that Earl Little had made when he left Georgia around 1915 after 4 of his brothers had been murdered, one of them by lynching. Malcolm X's father, Earl, left Georgia at that time. The other historic event, the Great Depression, began in 1929 with the stock market crash in the United States. Because the US economy was the largest in the world, this economic calamity reverberated around the entire globe and resulted in high rates of unemployment and poverty everywhere. There was an old saying in the Black community: when a white man catches a cold, the Black man gets pneumonia. Black ministers were heard to preach to their congregation, "Let Jesus lead you and Roosevelt feed you," in reference to the New Deal programs of President Roosevelt. The slogan, "the last hired and the first fired," referring to Black job seekers, first originated during this time, and by 1932, the unemployment rate for African Americans was 50%, while it was 25% for the rest of the population. And to make a bad situation worse, violence against African Americans increased because white men resented competing with Black men for the few jobs that were available. Those times were harsh for everyone, but despite that fact, Louise Little tried to provide for her family the best way that she knew how. She did housework and sewing for other families. Quote, "There were times when there wasn't even a nickel, and we would be so hungry we were dizzy. My mother would boil a big pot of dandelion greens, and we would eat that. Sometimes, if we were lucky, we would have oatmeal or cornmeal mush 3 times a day, or mush in the morning and cornbread at night." Despite their pride, the family was forced to accept free government food. Quote, "It seemed that everything to eat in our house was stamped, not to be sold. All welfare food bore this stamp to keep the recipients from selling it. It's a wonder we didn't come to think of not to be sold as a brand name." Unquote. Everyone was expected to contribute to the household income to the best of their abilities. And one day, in a desperate attempt to increase his meager earnings of $1 that Malcolm made after a grueling day of picking strawberries, he decided to gamble with a white classmate. Losing that hard-earned dollar taught Malcolm a lesson that he will never forget, that he never forgot. That when someone is winning all the time, they're not gambling but cheating. And he compared that to why the white man in America can get ahead and stay ahead. Quote, "He's a professional gambler. He has all the cards and the odds stacked on his side, and he has always dealt to our people from the bottom of the deck." Unquote. His mother, Louise, eventually had a nervous breakdown and was admitted to the Kalamazoo State Mental Hospital, where she spent the next 26 years. On Malcolm's infrequent visits, his mother recognized him less and less, and the visits always angered him because of how their situation was worsened by the cruelty of the system. The family was broken up by the social services, and Malcolm was sent to a foster home. Quote, "I truly believe that if ever a state social agency destroyed a family, it destroyed ours. We wanted and tried to stay together. Our home didn't have to be destroyed, but the welfare, the courts, and their doctor gave us the 1, 2, 3 punch. Hence, I have no mercy or compassion in me for a society that will crush people and then penalize them for not being able to stand up under the weight, unquote. This ordeal of Malcolm's family is another example of the systemic racism that permeates throughout every level of our society. It parallels the treatment of enslaved families at auctions when no regard was given to keeping them together, and parents and children were separated and sold to the highest bidder. And the parents could do nothing to protect their children. That fear of separation and anger at their helplessness stayed with them always. Lewis Hayden, a fugitive from enslavement during the 1830s, wrote about his feelings at his family being torn apart. Quote, I never saw anything in Kentucky which made me suppose that ministers or professors of religion considered it any more wrong to separate the families of slaves by sale than to separate animals. My master was a minister, and yet he sold my mother. When he was going to leave Kentucky for Pennsylvania, he sold all my brothers and sisters at auction. I stood and watched them sold, and I stood by and saw them sold. When I was just going up to the block, he swapped me off for a pair of carriage horses. I looked at those horses with strange feelings. I had indulged hopes that master would take me into Pennsylvania with him and I should get free. How I looked at those horses and walked around them and thought, for them, I was sold. Once my master had said in the pulpit that there was no more harm in separating a family of slaves than a litter of pigs, litter of pigs, unquote. The unspeakable stress that separation from their families and the threat of it was more than many African Americans could endure, and it wreaked havoc on their health. Even to this day, African Americans as a group suffer more from stress-related illnesses than the rest of the population because of the generational trauma that was inherited due to the abuse that began hundreds of years ago. According to the American Psychological Association, quote, the cumulative biological burden exacted on the body through daily adaptation to physical and emotional stress is considered to be a risk factor in several diseases: coronary vascular disease, obesity, diabetes, depression, cognitive impairment, and both inflammatory and autoimmune disorders, unquote. With all that was going on in his life, it was no surprise that Malcolm X became a juvenile delinquent. He ended up in Mason, Michigan with a white foster home, the Swirlings, as a temporary stop until he was old enough to be admitted to juvenile reform school. But luckily for him, the Swirlings liked Malcolm so much that they persuaded the officials to keep him out of the detention center. Malcolm's half-sister Ella, which you see on the picture photograph above there, invited him to Boston to visit for the summer. And on Malcolm's return to Michigan, he became more sensitive to the casual racism of the white community in which he lived. One day, a casual conversation with his English teacher, Mr. Ostrowski, changed his life forever. Quote, he told me, Malcolm, you ought to be thinking about a career. Have you been giving it some thought? Well, yes, sir. I've been thinking I'd like to be a lawyer. Lansing certainly had no Negro lawyers or doctors either in those days to hold up an image I might have aspired to. All I really knew for certain was that a lawyer didn't have to wash dishes as I was doing. Mr. Ostrowski looked surprised, I remember, and leaned back in his chair and clasped his hands behind his head. He kind of half smiled and said, Malcolm, one of life's first needs is for us to be realistic. Don't misunderstand me now. We all like you here, you know that. But you've got to be realistic about being a nigger. A lawyer, that's no realistic goal for a nigger. You need to think about something you can be. You're good with your hands, making things. Everybody admires your carpentry shop work. Why don't you plan on carpentry? People like you as a person. You get all kinds of work. It was then that I began to change inside, unquote. The question that Mr. Ostrowski asks Malcolm is the type of question that adults, even today, ask young people. In the early 1990s, one day when I was trying to make conversation with an African American teenage boy in Boston, I asked him that very same question. So, Gerald, what do you plan to do after graduation? And his response stopped me in my tracks. Miss Elder, I don't think that far ahead. My goal is to live to graduate high school. If I get that far, then I'll think about what comes next. The racism that Malcolm X experienced in the 1930s manifests itself in that instance by his teacher putting limits on him and his abilities, telling him how high in life he could expect to go and no further. That type of racism is so ingrained in our culture that African American youth often put limitations on themselves without anyone doing it for them. Besides, they have more important things to think about, like survival. For Gerald in the 1990s, he had already lost so many people in his life to violence that the possibility that it would also happen to him was never far from his mind. More than once, I've heard a white person say, "Why do you people always walk around with a chip on your shoulder?" Well, it's probably because, especially for young Black males, they know there's a target on their back. And some of you may remember in 2018, the "shut up and dribble" remark made by a white conservative talk show host to basketball star LeBron James when he was discussing the politics of the 45th president. Her intentions in making the remarks to James were clear. You are paid to play basketball, not to think. Just stay in your lane. Thankfully, James did not allow those remarks to limit his freedom of speech. But what about those out there who lack the status and prestige of a LeBron James? This is the type of internalized stress that Malcolm X must have felt when in 1941, at the end of 8th grade, his sister Ella gained custody of him and moved him to Boston. There, he became only interested in the short-term pleasures of life, not unexpected behavior considering his recent trauma of losing both his parents. Instead of enrolling in high school, he bounced around a few jobs that paid just enough to keep his hair combed and him in zoot suits and reefers, and hanging out with his buddy, Shorty. Malcolm's other passion at the time was dancing. Quote, "Everything felt right when I went into the ballroom. Hamp's band was working and that big wax floor was packed with people lindy hopping like crazy. I grabbed some girl I'd never seen, and the next thing I knew, we were out there lindying away and grinning at each other. It couldn't have been finer. I'd been lindying previously only in cramped little apartment living rooms, and now I had room to maneuver. Once I really got myself warmed and loosened up, I was snatching partners from among the hundreds of unattached freelancing girls along the sidelines. Almost every one of them could really dance. Boosting them over my hips, my shoulders, into the air. Though I wasn't quite 16 then, I was tall and raw-boned and looked like 21. I was also pretty strong for my age. Circling, tap dancing, I was underneath them when they landed, doing the flapping eagle and the kangaroo and the split. After that, I never missed a Roseland Lindy Hop as long as I stayed in Boston," unquote. In an effort to separate Malcolm from the bad influence of an older white woman, Ella got him a railroad job on the Yankee Clipper that ran from Boston to New York City. That was like adding grease to a flame. Quote, "New York was heaven for me, and Harlem was seventh heaven. I hung around in Small's Paradise in the Braddock Hotel bar so much that the bartenders began to pour a shot of bourbon, my favorite brand, when they saw me walk in the room. And the steady customers in both places, the hustlers and smalls, and the entertainers in the Braddock began to call me Red, a natural enough nickname in view of my bright red conch. On the trains, Malcolm's outrageous behavior was the source of a running bet that he would soon be fired. Quote, because I had rapidly become such an uncouth, wild young Negro, profanity had become my language. I'd even curse customers, especially servicemen. I couldn't stand them, unquote. In Harlem, Malcolm learned the ropes of living by his wits with his first job at Small's Paradise. But that job didn't last long. But by now, Malcolm was known as Detroit Red. And he soon acquired a reputation of being fearless, sometimes toting 3 guns at once. Necessary accessories because he was now a numbers runner for West Indian Archie, one of the most notorious bookies around. Malcolm lived on the edge, and his lifestyle led him to become addicted to cigarettes, cocaine, alcohol, and gambling, and he wasn't even yet 17 years old. In Harlem, Malcolm became the true definition of a hustler, uneducated, unskilled, at anything honorable, and nervy, cunning enough to live by my wits, exploiting any prey that presented itself, unquote. That was not a very admirable way to live, but Malcolm could not see a bright future for himself, just as Gerald, who I mentioned earlier, couldn't even envision a future for himself at all. So for a young African-American male who had already been told that he should aspire to be no more than a carpenter, when he really wanted to be an attorney, living life on the edge was Malcolm's way of showing the world that he was alive and living on his own terms and no one else's. After a series of near misses in Harlem and with various people he had crossed the wrong way, including West Indian Archie, who thought that he had stolen money from him, Malcolm became desperate. Quote, everything was building up, closing in on me. I was trapped in so many terms. West Indian Archie gunning for me, the Italians who thought I stuck up their crap game after me, the scared kid hustler I'd hit, the cops. For 4 years up to that point, I'd been lucky enough or slick enough to escape jail or even getting arrested or any serious trouble at all. But I knew that any minute now something had to give, unquote. Malcolm fled Harlem for Boston with Shorty's help. But the near misses of New York City quickly became a distant memory. And Malcolm became even more reckless and fearless in Boston. That lifestyle came to a screeching halt in 1946 when he and Shorty received an 8 to 10 year sentence for the many robberies they committed with the aid of 2 white women. The white accomplices were given basically the equivalent of a slap on the wrist. In prison, Malcolm X shook his addictions, and with the encouragement of many family members who had joined a new religious organization called the Nation of Islam, his remarkable spiritual transformation and educational journey began. Quote, every book that I read gave me a little bit more sensitivity to the deafness, dumbness, and blindness that was afflicting the Black race in America. Let me tell you something. From then until I left that prison, in every free moment I had, if I was not reading in the library, I was reading on my bunk. You couldn't have gotten a book out of my hands for anything. Between Mr. Muhammad's teachings, my correspondence, my visitors, usually Ella and Reginald, his brother, and my reading, months passed by without my even thinking about being in prison. In fact, up to then, I had never been so truly free in my life. And when I progressed to really serious reading, every night at about 10 p.m., I would be outraged at the lights out call. It always seemed to catch me right in the middle of something engrossing. Fortunately, right outside my door was a corridor nightlight that cast a dim glow into my room. That glow was enough to read by once my eyes adjusted to it. So when lights out came, I would sit on the floor where I could continue to read with that glow. Initially, Malcolm X was attracted to books because of his just natural curiosity. But when he converted to the Nation of Islam, he directed his readings to help him further understand the situation of the Black man in America. Quote, "The teachings of Mr. Muhammad stressed how history had been whitened. When white men had written history books, the Black man simply had been left out. Mr. Muhammad couldn't have said anything that would have struck me much harder. I have never forgotten how when we were in class, me and all those whites had studied 7th grade U.S. history back in Mason, Michigan. The history of the Negro had been covered in one paragraph, and the teacher had gotten a big laugh of his joke. Quote, Negroes' feet are so big that when they walk, they leave a hole in the ground. Ha, 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 ha. Unquote. Yes, nearly 30 years after that fact, Malcolm even remembered the jarring laughter of that teacher. Of all the history that Malcolm was exposed to in 7th grade, that one remark stood out for him. It reminds me of a poem by the Harlem Renaissance poet, Countee Cullen, entitled Incident. Once riding in old Baltimore, head filled with glee, I saw a Baltimorean keep looking straight at me. Now I was 8 and very small, and he was no bit bigger. And so I smiled, but he poked out his tongue and called me nigger. I saw the whole of Baltimore from May until December. Of all the things that happened there, that's all that I remember. Through his self-education, Malcolm X began to understand more fully what was happening to the Black man in America, and thus to himself. Quote, I found books like Will Durant's Story of Civilization. I read H.G. Wells' Outline of History. Souls of Black Folk by W.E.B. Du Bois gave me a glimpse of the Black people's struggle with history before they came to this country. Carter G. Woodson's Negro History opened my eyes about Black empires before the Black slave was brought to the United States and the early Negro struggles for freedom. Rogers' 3 volumes of Sex and Race told me about race mixing before crisis time, and Aesop being a Black man who told fables. I learned about Egypt's pharaohs, the Coptic Christian empires, about Ethiopia, and about China as the oldest civilization in the world. And I will never forget how shocked I was when I began reading about slavery's total horror. It made such an impact on me that it later became one of my favorite subjects when I became a minister of Mr. Muhammad's. The world's most monstrous crime, the sin and the blood on the white man's hand, are almost impossible to believe. Books like the one by Frederick Law Olmsted opened my eyes. Unquote. So what were some of those things that Malcolm X learned from those books in addition to what he said today? Well, in 1641, the Massachusetts Body of Liberties stated, quote, there can never be any bond, slavery, village, or captivity among us unless it be by lawful captives taken in just wars, and such strangers as willingly sell themselves or are sold to us. So basically, in 1641, the United States was establishing the legality of slavery in this country. Later, when the 13 colonies broke away from England in 1775, they declared their intention through 2 documents, the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution. And the Declaration of Independence states, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Article 1, Section 2 of the U.S. Constitution makes clear that the words of the Declaration of Independence are for free persons only, specifically free white men. It includes Indians not taxed, and for the purpose of calculating how many representatives a state would have, all other persons would be counted as 3/5 of a person. The author of the Declaration of Independence, The author of the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson, enslaved 600 individuals during his lifetime, but he only freed 2 of them, despite those comments that he wrote in the Declaration of Independence, those words he wrote in the Declaration of Independence. One of the 2 people he freed during his lifetime was Sally Hemings, an enslaved girl that he started a relationship when she was 14 and he was 45. The other person he freed during his lifetime was one of the children that he had with Sally Hemings. 5 other people were freed after he died, and the other 600 were sold at his death for his debts. Jefferson also owned nearly 27,000 acres of land at Monticello, which made him one of the wealthiest men in Virginia at this time, in the colonies. And to give you some idea of how big 27,000 acres is, it's the equivalent of 42 square miles, or an area that extends from Waterford to the north of Troy, to Albany to the south, and from Brunswick to the east to Latham to the west. So Jefferson was a very, very wealthy man, and most of that land was just given in land grants, in other words, taken from the Native Americans. In fact, not just Jefferson, but the first 12 presidents of the United States, of the first 12 presidents, 10 of them were slave owners. The only 2 who weren't were John Adams and his son, John Quincy Adams. And that was just the beginning of Malcolm X's introduction to American history. He learned so much more. Quote, the prison library's collection also contained some bound pamphlets of the Abolitionist Anti-Slavery Society of New England. I read descriptions about atrocities, saw those illustrations of Black slave women tied up and flogged, with whips of Black mothers watching their babies being dragged off, and all types of atrocities. I'm sorry. I read about the slave preacher, Nat Turner, who put the fear of God into the white slave master. Nat Turner wasn't going around preaching pie in the sky and nonviolent freedom for the Black man. The example of Nat Turner probably resonated with Malcolm because he remembered his father, Earl Little, going around preaching, and just as Nat Turner did, not pie in the sky, but self-reliance and self-defense. Malcolm X would have read about the efforts to rewrite the reasons for the Civil War with a campaign known as the Lost Cause narrative. He would have read about the efforts to re-enslave illiterate Blacks through peonage and sharecropping at the beginning of the 20th century. And he also would have read about the proliferation of what's called sunset towns, which fed the chain gangs. I'm going to have to skip over some things here. I apologize, I just skipped over a section called Scientific Racism, but I'm sort of trying to keep aware of the time. Malcolm X knew that So what made Malcolm X a brilliant speaker? So in addition to the deep reading that he did to understand the true history of the Black people in America, he also read widely around different subjects. That wide reading led him to understand that what was happening to Black people in America was not an isolated occurrence, but part of a larger continuum of the efforts of white civilizations to dominate non-white civilizations. Quote, I read Herodotus, the father of history, and I read other histories. Book after book showed me how the white man had brought upon the world's Black, brown, red, and yellow peoples every variety of the sufferings of exploitation. First, always religiously, he branded heathen and pagan labels upon ancient non-white cultures and civilizations. The stage was thus set. He then turned upon his non-white victims his weapons of war. When in 1857, some of the desperate people of India, Some of the desperate people of India finally mutinied in accepting for the African slave trade. Nowhere has history recorded any more unnecessary, bestial, and ruthless human carnage than the British suppression of the non-white Indian people. In fact, in India, from 1600 up through the 1940s, well over 100 million people in that country had died from famines or were killed as the direct result of British colonial policies. Britain became to India, like the company store was to the sharecropper. You either had to buy from British retailers or you starved. Malcolm X's study of what was happening in China was equally enlightening. When the white man professes ignorance about why the Chinese hate him so, my mind can't help flashing back to what I read there in prison about how the blood forebears of this same white man raped China at a time when China was trusting and helpless. Those original white Christian traders sent into China millions of pounds of opium. And by 1839, so many of the Chinese were addicts that China's desperate government destroyed 20,000 chests of opium, and the first Opium War was promptly declared by the white man. Imagine declaring war about someone who objects to being addicted. Kill the foreign white devils was the 1901 Chinese war cry in the Boxer Rebellion. Those readings also revealed to Malcolm X that the Nation of Islam was not the first to refer to the white man as white devils. But he also knew that this phrase summarized why the prison population was so primed to become Muslim converts, because, quote, "The white man is the devil" is a perfect echo of the black convict's lifelong experience. For some reason, the white man always needed to justify his nefarious actions, just as he justified subjecting the black man in America due to allegedly inferior genes. All of his wars of domination were justified in the name of spreading Christianity, from the Great Crusade in 1100 to Columbus's invasion of the Americas in 1492, up to the British invading everywhere on the globe around the 18th and 19th century in an attempt to create an empire where, quote, "the sun never sets." In a 1962 essay, James Baldwin, who was another person who thought deeply about the black experience, once shared an African saying: when the white man came to Africa, the white man had the Bible and the African had the land. But now it is the white man who is being reluctantly and bloodily separated from the land, and the African who is still attempting to digest or vomit up the Bible, unquote. And Malcolm X came to the same conclusion, quote, "Christianity is the white man's religion. The Holy Bible is in the white man's hands, and his interpretations of it have been the greatest single ideological weapon for enslaving millions of non-white human beings. Every country the white man conquered with his guns, he has always paved the way and salved his conscience by carrying the Bible and interpreting it to call the people heathens and pagans then he sends his guns, and then his missionaries behind the guns." Malcolm X was released from prison in 1952 after serving 7 years of his 8 to 10 year sentence, and he emerged as a new man, fully enveloped in his new religion, the Nation of Islam. His brother Reginald had begun suggesting that perhaps Mr. Muhammad that Malcolm adored was lacking in his morals, but Malcolm would not hear any of that. When he later heard that Reginald had been sanctioned by Mr. Muhammad from straying from the strict moral code the Muslims had to follow, Malcolm was simply saddened that Reginald had so little self-discipline. But Malcolm X had but one single desire: to serve Mr. Muhammad faithfully and to the best of his abilities. Malcolm X felt to the very center of his core that Mr. Muhammad had saved his life, and he was determined to share that message of salvation with as many Black people as possible. Through Malcolm's efforts, the ranks of the NOI began to increase at such a prodigious speed that people outside of the NOI began to take notice. And Malcolm was assigned as lead minister for Temple No. 7 in New York City. By 1959, four things happened in the NOI. A journalist approached the NOI to do a documentary that was named The Hate Produced. That documentary was aired in late 1959, and every aspect was designed to heighten the shock value to the public. The first shock value was that there were Black people in America who actually hated white people and weren't afraid to state that fact. James Baldwin once said, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced," unquote. And unfortunately, too many whites were not yet ready to face that truth. This is Malcolm X, quote, sorry, that's James Baldwin. "I want to tell you something. This pattern, this system that the white man created of teaching Negroes to hide the truth from him behind a facade of grinning, yes sir bossing, foot shuffling, and head scratching, that system has done the American white man more harm than an invading army could do him, because all this has steadily helped this American white man to build up deep in his psyche absolute conviction that he is superior," unquote. When many Black leaders got on the bandwagon of criticizing and denouncing Malcolm X, he called it the way he saw it. Quote, "Today's Uncle Tom doesn't wear a handkerchief on his head. This modern 20th century Uncle Tom often now wears a top hat. He's well-dressed and well-educated. And he is what's called a professional Negro. By that, I mean his profession is being a Negro for the white man." When Malcolm X was accused of creating animosity to encourage the Black man to study, creating animosity when he encouraged the Black man to study self-defense to better protect himself and his community, Malcolm X asked, quote, "Why does judo or karate suddenly get so onerous because Black men study it?" Across America, the Boy Scouts, the YMCA, the YWCA, they all teach judo. It's all right. It's fine until Black men teach it. Even little grammar school girls are taught to defend themselves, unquote. When they claimed that Malcolm X was talking and trying to incite violence, he said, quote, "The greatest miracle Christianity has achieved in America is that the Black man in white Christian hands has not grown violent. It is a miracle that 22 million Black people have not risen up against their oppressors, in which they would have been justified by all moral criteria, and even in this by the democratic tradition," unquote. I'm sorry, I'm really sort of trying to cover as much over the swath of information that I have. During this period, from 1959 up to 1962, Malcolm X began to hear rumblings of jealousy, which he tried to ignore, rumblings of jealousy in the Nation of Islam. But less information appeared about him in the newspaper that he founded, Muhammad Speaks. Around 1963, Malcolm began to realize that the Nation of Islam had really been betrayed by Mr. Muhammad, as his brother Reginald suggested earlier. But he was not yet ready to cast aside the very basis of his spiritual foundation. So he made a decision to look the other way from Mr. Muhammad's transgressions. But other Muslims around the country were also hearing the same rumors. In an attempt to deflect the rumors away from Mr. Muhammad, the leadership of the NOI made it appear that Malcolm was the one spreading the rumors. So they developed a Let's Hate Malcolm campaign. Now Malcolm X had to battle on two fronts. In addition to knowing that the NOI leadership wanted to muzzle him, he was also, because of his public appearances in many debates, becoming the face and the focal point of attack against Muslims in this country. Malcolm X began to receive more and more mail from whites, which expressed a desire for more explanations regarding Mr. Muhammad's teachings, particularly the phrase white devil. And Malcolm X explained, quote, collective white man's historical record, his cruelties, evils, and greed that have seen him act like a devil toward the non-white man. Where was the A-bomb dropped? To save American lives? I don't think so. Can the white man be so naive as to think the clear import of all of this would be lost on the non-white 2/3 of the Earth's population? Before that bomb was dropped right over here in the United States, what about the 100,000 loyal, naturalized, and native-born Japanese American citizens who were herded into camps behind barbed wire? But how many German-born naturalized Americans were herded behind barbed wire? Why not? They were white. By 1963, America was going through a lot. On May 17th, mass student protests in Birmingham, Alabama, for the mass student protests in Birmingham, Alabama, the Birmingham police brought out fire hoses and tack dolls, and those photographs from those attacks were spread around the world. Malcolm X, how can the white American government figure on selling democracy and brotherhood and non-white peoples if they read and hear every day what's going on right here in America? In August 28, 1963, the March on Washington occurred. Okay. And September 17th, 4 little girls were bombed out of a church in Birmingham. And on November 22nd, President Kennedy was assassinated. And for all those events, Malcolm had something to say. But for the assassination of the president, he basically told America, so the chickens are coming home to roost. And America couldn't take it, and they really dumped on Malcolm for that remark. And the Nation of Islam used that as an excuse to put him on a 90-day muzzle. That muzzle made Malcolm realize that he needed to break away from the Nation of Islam. So he made a decision to do that. And before he did that, he was going to form a new organization to fight for the economic rights of all blacks. But before he did that, he went to Mecca, and that trip to Mecca really opened his eyes to, and I'll just read it, what he said about his trip to Mecca. For his trip to Mecca, he was exposed to the idea that brotherhood could exist between people everywhere. America needs to understand Islam. Throughout my travels in the Muslim world, I have met, talked, and even eaten with people who in America would have been considered white. But the white attitude was removed from their minds by the religion of Islam. I have never before seen sincere and true brotherhood practiced by all colors together, by all brothers together, irrespective of their colors. And I'm going to just wrap it up at this point. When Malcolm X returned from Mecca, he decided that his organization was going to fight for true economic rights for all African Americans, and he realized that his position of, and I'll just quote again, in the past, I have made sweeping indictments of all white people. I will never be guilty of that again, as I know now that some white people are truly sincere, that some truly are capable of being brotherly toward a black man. The true Islam has shown me that a blanket indictment of all white people is as wrong as when whites make blanket indictments against blacks. So Malcolm says, I've had enough of someone else's propaganda. I'm for truth, no matter who tells it. I'm for justice, no matter who is for or against it. I'm a human being first and foremost. And as such, I'm for whoever and whatever benefits humanity as a whole. I have cherished my demagogue role. I know that societies often have killed the people who have helped to change those societies. And if I can die having brought any light, having exposed any meaningful truth that will help to destroy the racist cancer that is malignant in the body of America, then all credit is due to Allah. Only the mistakes have been mine. Thank you. And if anyone has questions, please come up to the microphone.
Does anyone have any questions? All right, thank you. Give Rosalyn Elder a round of applause. She has books for purchasing. We have some refreshments around the corner to the left. I'm sorry that some of the students left early. I meant to say that earlier. But there's some cookies and some fruits and some water and all that good stuff around the corner as well. Thank you all for coming out.
Thank you.